This video, we're taking a look at what it was like to be a Roman slave. Not many people know this, but slavery was one of the uglier sides of ancient Roman society. Sure, the Romans gave us scientists, artists, and philosophers, but somehow no one seems to talk about how cruel their slavery practices were. These slaves were essentially the backbone of the entire empire until the day that it fell. But despite working all day and night, these slaves were barely treated like humans. Most ancient Roman prisoners were foreigners and were usually prisoners of war. However, some of them also ended up here because they were kidnapped and sold at slave markets. What happened at these slave markets was that these poor people would be stripped down and put on show so that the noblemen and women from the Roman families could come and pick a slave for their families. Anyone who had enough money could buy them. Once the deal was made, these slaves were the property of their new owners, had to work for no money, and were left entirely at the mercy of their masters. Typically, people in this era would even have over 400 slaves because that's how normalized all of it was. Both men and women were sold at these markets, along with young boys were the most expensive to buy. Some slaves who knew how to read and write would be used to teach children, women would work as hairdressers, and cooks and other slaves would spend their days taking care of their masters in any way that they were asked to. Some Roman slaves also ended up working as concubines if that is what their masters asked of them. So, what was a day in the life of an ancient Roman slave like? First of all, no matter what, these slaves couldn't argue with their owners. Whatever their owners asked of them, they absolutely had to do. If they failed to do so, not only would they be punished, but in worst cases, their owners would actually end up killing them because that's how invaluable their lives were. After killing some slaves off, the owners would then go ahead and buy new ones that were always readily available at the slave markets. Not just slaves, but their entire families also ended up becoming the property of their owners. Even after working hard all day in mines under terrible and almost deadly working conditions, these slaves were often beaten up, whipped, and even branded if they failed to please their masters. Some slaves were also involved in agricultural work, and while that might sound better than working down in mines surrounded by toxic fumes, farmers didn't treat these slaves any different from the animals on their land. Sometimes the slaves would be denied food and water if they failed to meet their master's expectations, and of course, if it wasn't already obvious by now, all of this labor was done for free, with the slaves getting absolutely nothing out of their hard work. Now, because slavery was so rampant in ancient Rome, philosophers like Seneca did try and get people to treat them fairly. However, that obviously didn't work. These poor slaves couldn't even try and escape since they weren't taught Latin, which meant that they couldn't ask anyone for help. And if they did, they would instantly be killed along with their families. The only ancient Roman slave that is known to have escaped the empire is known as Spartacus, who ran away and formed his own army of slaves to take down the Romans. However, this never really ended up happening because the Roman army managed to stop any more slaves from escaping and joining Spartacus and killed every single one of them who had survived the battle, teaching all the other slaves back home a deadly lesson. Because these slaves worked everywhere from private homes to factories, farms, and even on government projects such as roads and buildings, it was often hard to tell the difference between them and the actual Roman public. In fact, these slaves looked so similar to the Romans that the Senate considered making them wear special clothing so that people could identify them. But this idea was ruled out since the Senate was scared of the slaves rebelling if they ever saw their strength in numbers. Now, what's really fascinating is that unlike modern slavery, the ancient Roman slaves could very easily obtain freedom through a process called manumission. If a master wished, they could either grant their slaves complete freedom, or in other cases their slaves were allowed to buy themselves their freedom. Then these emancipated slaves, called freedmen or freedwomen, were allowed to continue living and working in Rome, only restricted from being part of the public office. But that doesn't mean life was easy for these freedmen and freedwomen. Even after being granted their freedom, they were publicly humiliated, subjected to abuse by almost all citizens in ancient Rome. The manumission actually gave these freed people even lesser rights than they had as slaves, not allowing them to retain any wealth or property, with all of their assets going back to their masters who probably didn't even need them. Because ancient Rome placed so much emphasis on hierarchies, these Roman slaves were stigmatized for the rest of their lives, finding more humiliation than peace, even in freedom. That's a wrap for what it was like to be a Roman slave. Do you think you could have survived a life like this? See you next time with something new. And until then, goodbye.